Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We're excited that you joined us to learn more about leveraging utilization and activity data to improve your workplace. I'm Dera Arnold, a studio director at Gensler and your moderator for today. I co-lead our team that specializes in developing and managing Gensler's space and occupancy platform, also known as Wisp, and our iPad app Observe, which is used for utilization and activity studies. You will hear both Wisp and Observe mentioned throughout the presentation today. We're very passionate about helping clients collect, analyze, and leverage utilization and activity data to transform their real estate portfolios and to elevate their workplace experience. Today, we'll hear from two of our experts on this topic. I'm grateful to have Mitchell Bobman and Joan Meyers with me. Mitchell is a member of our analytics team. He works alongside our strategists and designers on all sorts of projects, helping them to collect data, synthesize and analyze it, and ultimately to develop insights and make recommendations. Joan is a principal and managing director. She guides our team in delivering software and services that bring clarity to corporate portfolios and leverages data to inform strategy. Her deep understanding and experience in data integrity, project management, and spatial data management lend to her unique perspective on innovative solutions. I'll hand it over to Mitchell and Joan in just a moment, but before doing so, let's review our agenda for today. To start out, I'll share the fundamental differences between utilization and activity data. Mitchell will share methods for capturing this type of data along with client stories. Joan will share how you can get started with this data to improve your workplace, and we'll wrap it up with any questions. If you do have comments or questions throughout this webinar, please use the questions box in the GoToMeeting window. So let's start out with the difference between utilization and activity data. With utilization data, we learn how often a space is used throughout the day. Through working with our clients, we've learned that questions about utilization come up early in the conversation when planning a real estate strategy, and we agree it is definitely a key metric for workplace decisions. But with utilization data, we miss out on what's happening in each space. And that's where the value of activity data comes in. We've also learned through years of working with our clients that it's valuable to understand the activity or how the space is being used, in addition to understanding how often the space is used. As a few examples for what can be learned from activity data, we can gain insights on how people work and what they're doing at their desks or in collaboration spaces. We can assess whether conference rooms are being used effectively or as designed, and we can understand what equipment is being utilized. This data is valuable to inform your design and workplace strategy or to measure the success of it. Insights and what can be derived from activity data are unique for each client, and it depends on several things, such as the size of an organization, the industry, culture, and their strategic goals. Now I'll turn it over to Mitchell, who will share some of his experiences with this topic, along with some unique client stories.
Thanks, Dara. So when it comes to collecting data, whether it's utilization or any types, there's typically two extremes in how you can approach it. One option can be you go out and collect data and then see what questions you can answer with it later on, or you identify these questions first and then use that to back into what types of data you'll need to eventually answer it. And so my personal preference in the projects that I've worked on has been the latter. They've been some of the more creative and impactful projects. And in terms of utilization data, they tend to fall within one of three major categories. So these types of questions can be around utilization, so understanding the utilization of a workplace over time, understanding things like mobile and co-working support, maybe optimal sizes and quantities and locations of collaboration spaces. Or they might be around financial or real estate impact, prioritizing capital projects over time, things like phasing, deciding whether you need to acquire or shed real estate. Or they could be about human capital, using utilization data to help optimize workflows or processes, understand things like health and wellness, maybe improve your net promoter score. And so, while you need to be able to answer these questions, you're going to ultimately need data to help answer them. And the types of data for utilization can come from many sources and in many types. And a couple of major buckets that we like to group these types of data are facilities, observational, sensory, exhaust, and secondary. So facilities, or often operational data, is typically generated from facilities management systems or HR or finance teams in order to manage space or personnel or both. So this can be information related to headcount, like departmental role. It can be floor plans or CAFM data. It could be space assignments, or maybe in real estate data such as CapEx or OpEx, conditions assessment, things like that. Then you have observational data. So it takes that information and really generates in a different way. So this is typically based by things like surveys or interviews meant to better understand employees or facilities. So while they can be as simple as, is a space occupied, it can get into some of the more activity-based information like Dara was talking about. So how many people are in a space? Is technology being used? How many people are wearing red shirts? You can get a lot more granular or specific with the types of questions that you want to answer with observational data. And so a couple examples of that type of data is our Observe app, which Dara mentioned, or Workplace Performance Index, something that Kensler does. It's around understanding how the relationship between a workplace and the people that use it. So I won't get into too much detail because I know I have some fun things planned with those over the course of the summer, but they're just two examples of how observational data can be generated. Then there's sensory. That's one of the more popular and exciting ones. That's data generated by sensors in a physical space. So it's utilization or occupancy sensors, climate or environmental sensors, apps and beacons, things like that. Then you have exhaust data, which can be a lot more powerful than people think. So what exhaust data is a byproduct of an existing operational system already in use. So it can be things like wireless network activity, maybe data from conference room reservations, or security badge data. It's things that organizations are already collecting and already generating. They just might not be using it for utilization. And the last is secondary data, which is typically really useful for context in a problem. So these are publicly available or subscription-based data sets used to supplement analysis. So when you see things like benchmark comparisons or data around a real estate market, that's typically coming from a secondary data source, something that someone's purchasing or acquiring, maybe not in that specific project, but then applying it towards that. And so from a boots on the ground perspective, not only is all this data coming in different forms, shapes, and sizes, but they're also coming from different teams within an organization. So, it's all about corralling your facilities team and your IT teams and your HR teams to track down this information. The other question around this type of data that I get asked a lot is, what's the right type of data and information for my project? And so in addition to the fact that data comes in forms, shapes, and sizes, all these different types of data have their own strengths and weaknesses. And a couple lenses that are pretty useful to understand these strengths and weaknesses can be scalability, granularity, and accuracy. So with scalability, it's understanding whether a specific type of data is helpful for the type of problem you're trying to approach. If you're trying to understand utilization of a seat through a seat sensor, that might make sense for a couple seats. But if you have 30,000 seats across a global portfolio, maybe it's not as scalable as, let's say, exhaust data or facilities data. Granularity, how closely aligned to the data is to the questions that I hope to answer. So similarly, exhaust data around how much people use a Wi-Fi network might be great information, but it won't tell you maybe a more specific question you hope to answer that something like a survey can really get very accurate on. And speaking of accuracy, the last lens that we often put this through is how trustworthy is this information? You'll ultimately be making capital decisions or operational decisions based on this data that you collect. And do you feel confident in that being the backbone of it? And it's important that this doesn't just apply for the data itself, but also the management of it. So, for example, looking at facilities data, one thing they've seen in larger companies is that the larger you are, the harder it is to maintain facility management systems and headcount data. And using the term garbage in, garbage out is something that gets thrown around a lot, but there really are implications to being complacent around the data quality of these different systems. So just because you have a certain type of system in place doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to keep track of itself on its own. So one of these types of data is sensory data. Not only is it one specific type, but it also comes in many shapes and sizes. So you've got motion sensors, you've got sensors embedded in CO2 in the air systems, embedded in the lights, infrared, in cameras. And at the end of the day, surveys are also still a type of sensor. They just might not have the bells and whistles and gravitas that some of the others do. And in a similar way, all these different types of sensors also have their own strengths and weaknesses in terms of the type of technology and the feasibility of implementing these things. And so, all of this reminding around strengths and weaknesses is just to drive home the ideas that no one technology is going to answer every question for you. And no one sensor is going to be able to answer every question for you. And so at the end of the day, it's about the fact that all these sensors and these different data sets are tools within your toolbox. And sometimes you might need to bring out multiple bells and whistles and buzzsaws and lasers, and sometimes you just need a hammer. So understanding the fact that these are all tools at your disposal and understanding when to implement what is a really important thing to remember. And so the next thing we'll do is walk through a couple examples of where we did use some of these tools to solve real-world problems with clients. So the first one that comes up a lot is understanding utilization data for informing interiors programming. So we had a client that came to us and said, hey, we have 4,000 plus people at a headquarters campus. We know we're gonna wanna do some type of intervention on the campus in the future, but before we do that, let's understand how our campus works today. So we worked with them and collected everything from Observe app data to data through Wisp, through our Workplace Performance Index, data from the conference room reservation system, the Wi-Fi, ID badges, HR metadata, and understood that when we wanted to answer different questions, we could overlay 1 to all 7 if needed. And so these types of questions ranged from what's our average utilization for workstations and offices, then might get a little bit more specific in terms of, how does this compare across our different business units? Then we can start to overlay even more things like, okay, we can use utilization data to understand how reservable spaces, so like conference rooms, huddle rooms, how often they're used. But then we have another source of quote unquote truth, which is our reservation system. Well, can we put some of the concepts of the people squatting and the no-shows for meeting rooms that happen in nearly every workplace and put some real hard data to that and understand what our inefficiencies are? And so you can do that, right? You can understand when you overlay these two data sets across one another, a more robust version of what this reality looks like on the floor. And with all these collaboration spaces, they're becoming a much more important focus for workplace. And so can we help right-size the amount and the size of these rooms more better than they are today? So, one thing we often see is that roughly 3/4 of all the meetings that happen in a workplace are between 4 people or fewer. And so does the class with this client fit what the size of their meetings are like? Can we look and see, yes, there's a meeting going on in this 14-person conference room, but it's just 2 people. Do they need all that space? Do they need all that capacity? So it's a way of just helping to get a lot more specific, helping to right-size the type of space they need so that when they do want to start to implement some interventions, whether it's renovations, whether it's new construction, they know what type of space they need and what type of use to anticipate in it. And so while understanding sheer utilization from a space standpoint is important, this data can also be useful for an operational strategy. So we had another client that was already collecting all sorts of utilization data, using it to help inform their key space decisions, but wanted to look at mobility and came to us and said, well, we're collecting all this observational data already. Is there a way that we can use that to help make the most well-informed decision? And so what we did was we put together what we called a mobility adoption index. It used data for utilization as well as some information around these different departments in the company. So, you know, what type of space do they use or do they need for a workplace? How large are they, right? It's probably easier to implement things across a smaller group than a very large group that's spread out. And can we help to understand what groups might be most ideal to be innovators in mobility, early adopters, early majority, late majority, laggards. And so not to say that this is the gospel for how they should implement a strategy, but you know, can this send them on the right track to understand how to make these operational decisions? And the one thing that was interesting about this project was we basically used observational data as exhaust data. So it was already being collected for purpose A, and it's just sitting there, so why not think about how you can use it in another way or find more creative questions that you can answer with things that have already been collected. You've already done the grunt work, so let's get creative with it. And the last project that I'll run through, which was also really fun to work on, was a project we did with Northwestern University here in Chicago. And the challenge that they had was they had roughly 2 million square feet of common spaces. So your lobbies, your bathrooms, your corridors, spaces that everyone used that had a lot of impact and attention, but limited capital. They're, you know, hired institution, they only have so much to spend every year. How do you prioritize how your money gets spent across a campus or an institution? And so the project as a whole was around prioritizing spaces. So we used the Observe app and Wisp and Wi-Fi metadata in a really meaningful way to help them prioritize which spaces they might want to invest in first. And the role that Wi-Fi data played in this project was really interesting because we took this Wi-Fi data across their whole campus and basically used it to identify one of two pieces that were really important. So as an institution, they wanted to identify high value projects. And for them, the definition of high value meant relatively low cost and high impact. And how can you measure high impact across all sorts of times of the year, across all sorts of users, faculty, staff, students? Wi-Fi data across a really large campus can be a really scalable way to understanding that. So we're able to collect this data over a long period of time without having to, you know, send interns or students out on clipboards and collecting this information. And we're able to understand a holistic view of utilization across, you know, the summer period, the winter period, you know, reading week, exam week, and help them identify spaces that really get touched by a lot of people so that when they can go and look at their capital for the year, they know that the spaces that they're spending money on are ones that are going to have this high impact for them. And so, you know, these are 3 examples of really what the end game looks like and some of these really creative questions and how it looks when it's all cleaned and polished and implemented. But, you know, one thing that's always in conversation is all the work that it takes to get to that point and all the steps that you need to take to get there. And Joan, I think that's you're the best person to talk about how to get from square one to where I was talking about. So I'll flip it over to you.
Great, thanks, Mitchell. So I have been working with data for a long time, and as Dara said, I am still just as passionate today about the integrity of data as I was when I first started. And that's because with every project that I work on, if there's no integrity behind the data, it's just a lot of data. And it's not nearly as meaningful as one might think. You know, the common perception is that data is great and having more of it is exactly what you want. But if there's no integrity behind that data, it's just really a lot of data. So we all know that real estate is very expensive, and it doesn't matter if you're leasing a space or if you own a space, it's just expensive. And so with nobody really having a money tree, to my knowledge, it makes sense that you want to understand you know, how your space is being utilized and how you can maximize the space that you already have. So with that, where do you start? So the very first thing that you want to do is really understand what is the question that you're looking to answer, and be as specific here as you can, because a lot of times what we hear is that people want to just understand how their space is being utilized. But the very next question typically ends up being, well, what were they doing in the space? So very similar to what Mitchell was saying earlier, taking some time up front to really identify what questions are you trying to answer is key. And so it may be just about utilization, but it may also be, well, what is that financial impact? Or it might be about your people and how do you make them more productive in your space. So be as specific as you can at this point. Once you understand what the question is, then you're going to want to go through and identify what tools do we need to actually get at that data to answer the question. And there are many different types of sensors out, more coming out on the market each day, every day. So I'm not going to go into all the different types of sensors, but it doesn't matter whether it's a sensor or it's data that you already have. You're going to want to understand some certain aspects of that tool. So the first one is depth of data. And what do I mean by that? If you're looking, the examples that we've had, a couple of times already, if you're looking to understand, what is actually being used in your collaboration spaces, is it the technology, are people actually talking, are they using the whiteboard and stuff? You need to understand that if you have a sensor, for example, can that sensor answer those questions? So understand what the capabilities are and the depth of information that you're going to get from any tool that you're considering. Cost is always a factor because, as we know, some things that may look to be very cost effective, in the end, you might not get the information that you're actually looking for to answer your questions. So, pay attention to that by all means, but also keep in mind those questions that you're really trying to answer. Accuracy, that's another thing that no two things are created equal. We all know that. And it certainly is the case here as well. So once, a quick story here, at Gensler, we were testing out some camera sensors. And when we were looking at the actual data, we found that one room was utilized 100% of the time, and we took a step back and said, well, that seems really odd. So we should probably look into that a little bit. And what we found was that this particular camera sensor couldn't distinguish between a real person or a body in the room as opposed to a Christmas tree. And so the Christmas tree was being picked up as a person, which is, kind of funny when you look back at it. But the reality is that the integrity of the data for that room, for the whole time we were studying with that particular sensor, is really out the window, because now we can't tell by looking at data alone whether or not the utilization was actual utilization or if it was the Christmas tree. So, identifying the accuracy of, again, whatever tool you're using, that is really important for your end result to answer the question. Ease of implementation and privacy, I talk about these together because to me they go hand in hand, especially when you're looking at sensors, because installing a seat sensor to understand if a desk or a conference room seat is being used or utilized seems very straightforward. But if thought isn't put into how you're going to roll that out to your staff or your workplace, there may be a sense of Big Brother. And then what we have seen from that approach is that behaviors change. And remembering the questions, again, that we're trying to answer, 9 times out of 10, you don't want behavior to change. So you want it to be as point on as a normal work day or week or whatever that may be as possible. So keep that in mind, that just because something is maybe one of the most cost effective and easy to implement, it may not serve your purpose long term if it's not rolled out right with that change management to the overall staff to understand what the purpose is of that. And then your study time frame. Again, there's really probably not a silver bullet answer to any of this type of stuff. So more than likely, you're going to use 2 or 3 different sources of data. So it's really important that no matter which tools you're using, that you're using them for the same time frame, so that when you start to do your analysis, it's truly comparing apples to apples and getting that answer that you're looking for. So the next thing you're going to want to do then is, once you've picked out the tools and we know what the question is, we actually want to collect the data. And this can be very fun. I enjoy this part, but it also may not be as straightforward as one might think. So if you walk the space, you may also need to take into account, who is actually going to be doing that. Are you going to use your own staff? Are you going to hire temps to do that? Regardless of whether it's your own staff or temps, you're going to want to plan in time for training to make sure that whoever is walking the floor to capture the observations, that you've got the same mindset, so you have that level of integrity when you start to analyze the data. It may mean that you have room reservation systems already in place and you need your IT team involved to get you that data for the appropriate time frame. Or HR, you might want departmental data. You may have sensors already in place, and then the question becomes, do you as an organization own that and have access to that data, or do you need to contact that other vendor or the provider of that specific type of sensor to get the data from them? So all of that stuff needs to be taken into account, and then you actually collect the data. So once you've got the data, then it's time to actually analyze it. And one of the things that is not very well known if you don't typically work in this area is that you can put in the effort up front and you have all the right tools, the right time frame, and you've done everything that you can. But when it comes time to actually layer and join those data sets, data in and of itself is inherently dirty that way. So you need to have the appropriate people lined up to actually analyze and normalize the data for you from all of the different sources. Because again, it's probably multiple sources that you're going to want to join together to get the actual analysis. There's also, in many organizations, Gensler included, we have a lot of people who are very, very good and skilled at working with data. But it's been my experience that when it comes time to actually analyze it, it pays to have a true analyst do that step, because otherwise it's just, you're potentially missing out on multiple ways to look at that data from a different vantage point, again, all trying to help answer the questions that you identified up front. So once you've got that, then there's, you can look at charts and graphs, and you can depict the information or the utilization on a floor plan, whether it's from walking the floor with, observe a tool that way, or it can be the data that you've collected from your reservation system. All of that information can be displayed on floor plans or charts and graphs, again, all driving to the initial question that you were trying to answer. So then what you've got from the analysis will inform your strategy. And so it may support your strategy, or it may lead to more questions that you're going to want to, maybe take a step back and answer a little bit in more detail. So a few years ago, I was working with a client, and they were really taking a pretty radical approach at that time of changing their entire floor plan. They were introducing a lot of new technology. They were introducing some agile working environments, neighborhoods. So they were trying to change how people worked, in addition to, spending a lot of time up front, understanding what their needs were, both at the present time and then where they were trying to go. And so what they did was they decided to pilot their new strategy, and they built out a floor with all the technology and everything that they had in their plan, and then they studied it. They used observe and capturing utilization and everything, and they found that one area of the floor was not being used. And I personally was at this company, and I walked the floor, and the area, it was just beautiful. It was a lot of nice seating and all this stuff, but it just wasn't being used. And so that particular space throughout the entire floor wasn't being used, and people just couldn't adapt to that. So they went back and they tweaked a few things, they made a little bit of modifications, and they changed just that area of the floor. And then we watched it again. And those few minor changes were actually very beneficial, because then the staff just inherently knew how to use that space. And so then they modified their strategies, and then they started rolling out with this new design in this one area of the floor. So if you ever have, you know, a lot of change in your strategy that you're trying to implement, always consider a pilot, whether it's a floor or a building. It probably is going to be very beneficial for you to have a pilot in place. So the last thing that you're going to want to keep in mind is that, like everything else, things are constantly changing. So you've got, you know, new generations being brought into the workplace. You've got different types of work styles and different modes. Technology is always changing. So it makes sense that you know, something like this, understanding your workplace utilization and activity, is not a once and done type of thing. So keep that in mind, that everything is changing, and to really stay on top of it, you're going to probably want to do this repeatedly over time to make sure that the space is being used to its fullest potential. So with that, Dera, back to you with any questions.
Great, thank you, Mitchell and Joan, for sharing your expertise in those stories. We have received some questions. So Mitchell, here's one for you to start out with. Is there a brand or type of sensor that you recommend?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there's any one particular one that I would recommend. I think Joe made a good point, is that this is a marketplace that's both fragmented and changing constantly, and so I think the two questions to ask when you're looking at sensors to use in workplaces is one, that idea of scalability. Will it, you know, help scale with you in terms of is this a company that you think will be around to fit your needs in the long term? And then also, you know, granularity. Can it help answer the question that you're actually set out to answer? If it can hit those two things, then great. If not, then it's back to the drawing board, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Mitchell. Joan, here's one for you. If we already have sensors, is there something we can do with data in Wisp?
Yeah, it really depends on the type of sensor, but let's say you have seat sensors. We could potentially take that information, that data, and tie it to a floor plan so that you could see the heat map like you would as if you were walking the space and gathering information that way as well.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Mitchell, back to you on this one. How long does it generally take to capture and analyze data?
I wish it was quicker, but I think generally it's you know, it'll vary depending on really the biggest inflection point in terms of how much time it takes is as Joan talked about, it's how clean is that data. You know, as an analyst, I probably spend 3/4 of my time cleaning up and structuring and organizing, and 25% analyzing. So you know, it's a common misconception as far as what takes longer in that process, and cleaning things up is definitely the biggest part.
Okay, great. Joan, we'll hand this one to you. The question is, I'm a Wisp client. Is activity analysis included in my Wisp subscription?
The Wisp subscription has your floor plans and some other utilities built into Wisp. Capturing activity via Observe is not part of the typical subscription. However, Observe is floor plan based, and so if you are a current Wisp client, there is a real efficiency there to use Observe because your floor plans are already in the system.
Okay, thank you. Mitchell, here's one for you. Can you share any ROI that your customers have seen with space optimization or a utilization study?
Yeah, I think there's always ROI. You know, it's one is big in terms of how much space you can save across a portfolio. As Joan talked about, real estate's not cheap, and if you can find a more efficient way of using your space, the first step in doing so is understanding how people are using it. I think 9 times out of 10 people use space in the workplace less than what you would expect. So I think the more efficient you are around understanding what that use looks like, then the more efficient you can be about what your portfolio looks like. So absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Mitchell. Joan, you had mentioned that people have changed their behavior after realizing that there's a sensor. How do you catch that?
Well, let's see. If you keep track of your space, if you understand your utilization typically, or know your people, it becomes pretty evident if you, like your supervisors, if you talk to them and they know that, on any given day, the majority of the workforce is, in their seats or on the floor for, X amount of time, and then behavior changes. Maybe you see a lot of a spike in vacations or people working off-site or not coming into the office, things like that. So it's really about, knowing your people and having this ongoing pulse on your workplace to really be able to pick that stuff out.
Okay, thank you, Joan. Mitchell, is utilization data valuable if you have dedicated versus assigned seating?
Yeah, absolutely. I think utilization data applies to all sorts of office environments, and not only just in the types of seating that you have in your work seats, but also the collaboration space. I think that there's a lot of value in understanding how all of this collaboration space is used, because it does take up a lot of both square footage and attention in a workplace. So yes and yes.
Okay, thank you. Here's another one for you, Mitchell. Do you use a commercial BI platform to analyze your data, or is it within your Wisp platform?
So I think just as there's different types of data, as those are tools within a toolkit, as an analyst, we have multiple tools, and they'll range from using Wisp to help us contextualize and visualize things just as simple as understanding what space is where. And in addition to that, yeah, we have a suite of tools that we'll use both to compile the data, clean it, scrub it, organize it, analyze it, visualize it. So I think it's a combination of ones that are open source and free, like an R or essentially Excel, and others that we either pay for or have in-house, or that are a little bit less to get a hold of.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Joan, here's another one from a Wisp client. They have not heard of Observe. Can you briefly explain that?
Sure. Observe is an iPad app that is proprietary to Gensler, and we've built it in a way that it can be used to capture activity, utilization, or even condition assessment. So, true to its name, anything that you want to observe, we can create what we call a survey that would be downloaded to the Observe app, and then you take that app and you walk the floor and you answer the questions, and the data gets uploaded directly to Wisp, and so then we've got it tied to the appropriate spaces and things like that for the analysis.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joan. Mitchell, is it more valuable to do an activity analysis study pre or post design or strategy?
I think both are really valuable. One of the things that's always really interesting in terms of after you do an intervention of any sort or strategy, obviously beforehand helps you be as informed as possible when you do implement that strategy. But to do one after is, I think, equally as valuable, because you can understand what that impact is in how these new strategies are working. As Joan said, the concept of 20-year strategic plans are becoming, less and less useful as things change quicker. Maybe you need to constantly iterate how your space is working and keep fine-tuning. So understanding that's super important.
Thank you, Mitchell, and thank you, Joan. We do have some other questions, but if it didn't get answered, we'll go ahead and follow up with you afterwards to address those. Hopefully each of you on the call have learned some golden nuggets that you can take back to your own organizations. For those of you who are interested in further exploring this topic with us, please reach out to your Wisp advisor if you have one. If you did not have a Wisp advisor, please feel free to reach out to either Mitchell, Joan, or myself. We are hosting 2 additional webinars throughout this year, including planning for a relocation and Inform to Transform Your Workplace. And keep your eyes out for future invites. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.